Hi, my name is Holly. Thank you for joining me. We are doing this from Edison Ford Winter Estates. We do a digital discussion on a topic of history each month. And this month it is about George Armstrong Custer. And what am I in front of? I am in front of East Calvary Field. And that is where George Custer, in my opinion, had his biggest moment as an officer in the U.S. Volunteer Army. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I will have to tell you that if you've never been to Gettysburg, make sure you go. And this is a place that is often overlooked, including by my husband and I at times when we go visit different sites to do with the Civil War, particularly Gettysburg. But let's get started. George Armstrong Custer, and this is a Civil War picture of him. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about his background, about him in the Civil War, then him in the Indian Wars, as they were called, and particularly Little Bighorn. But he was born in December in New Rumley, Ohio. His father was a farmer and a blacksmith, and his mother a homemaker. He had three brothers. This information is important because they're going to come into the story of him as well. And a sister, and two of his younger brothers, Thomas and Boston, would also die at Little Bighorn. When Custer was young, he moved to Monroe, Michigan, because that's the state he is most identified with, to live with his half-sister. His mother had been married before her husband had died, so he had some half-siblings. He would later return to Ohio to attend college in Hopedale, which was close to New Rumley, his hometown. He graduated in 1856 and became a school teacher for a short time. That would be interesting to me to see what kind of school teacher he was like before enrolling in West Point. He was able to convince the congressman to back him up. He had to be nominated to go, which was kind of unusual because he really wasn't much of a scholar. But he would graduate last in a class at West Point, which he enrolled in July 1857. But he does graduate. We'll talk more about that later. But I wanted to show you this monument. There are so many monuments of Custer. I did not put them all in this presentation. But this one was erected in 1931 on the land where the home he was born in once stood. The original house he'd lived in was demolished in the late 1800s, and architects found the site where the house was located originally, and it became part of the memorial. And there was this one was after Libby Custer died, or the year she died. I'm trying to remember, but there were monuments that were taken down because Libby didn't like them. And I had that quote on the end of that page, but there's tons of Custer quotes, but this one I know he actually said, and I thought it was interesting. My purpose is to make my narrative as truthful as possible. But because he died so young, he had created his own narrative, but then it's up to somebody else to continue it, and that will be his wife, in my opinion, Libby Custer. He graduated last in his class from West Point in June 1861. I talk about this a couple times, 2 months after the start of the Civil War. He lacked the qualifications that others had, but he was confident, and he won over that congressman with his recommendation. So he gets into West Point. He enrolls as a cadet, and he was a member of the class of 1862, because back then you had to go for 5 years, but you will learn soon that that was not going to happen. There were 79 cadets that got accepted, and they engaged in a rigorous 5-year program. He graduated at the bottom of his class. He was 34 out of 34. 23 of his peers had dropped out, and some other ones just had left to go and join the Confederacy. West Point wasn't a perfect fit for Custer, who, though he longed to climb to a higher rank in life, he wasn't dirt poor, but his parents were everyday people. Custer wanted more. But he had a rebellious streak, and he was a poor student, prone to misconduct. He was frequently disciplined. He almost was expelled, and he finished last in his class, as I've mentioned several times. In addition to his poor academic showing, just a few days after graduation, he failed as an officer of the guard to prevent a fight between two cadets at West Point. He was nearly court-martialed in the aftermath, so this is going to be, but he wasn't. and he was ultimately saved, believe it or not, which is a horrible thing to say, but the Civil War came along and they needed officers. And because of the Civil War, they let his class graduate a year early. The rules went out the window. He constantly at West Point challenged established rules and regulations. Over 4 years, he accumulated an astonishing, an unbelievable 726 demerits, making it one of the worst records, the most notorious conduct records in West Point history. I tried to find out if there was anybody with a greater number, but I really couldn't. So let's just say he's at the top, if not the top, in, if you can call getting 726 demerits. That means he got in trouble that many times. I can't believe they haven't allowed him to graduate. There are other people that were expelled for lesser offenses. By the way, Robert E. Lee, he never had one demerit. Despite his low marks, Custer joined the Union's 2nd Cavalry as a second lieutenant under Major General George McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac. And that's the one, there are several armies, but that's the one that most people are most familiar with, that will many times challenge Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Custer developed a reputation as a risk taker early in the war. I think a lot of people don't even realize he was participating in the Civil War. He's known for Little Bighorn, but he had quite a record in the Civil War. He was known for his bravery and being brash. He became known as a publicity seeker, using every opportunity to get himself in front of the cameras. And that's true of some other people in the Civil War as well, though some of them are focused on what they believe was their cause. He'd like to get newspaper men. They were his best friends. George McClellan and his staff were reconnoitering a potential crossing point on the Chickahominy River during the Peninsula Campaign. Custer overheard General John Barnard say, "I wish I knew how deep it is," talking about the river. So you know what Custer does? He goes out there on his horse to the middle of the river, sits there on his horse, turns to the officers and shouts, "McClellan, that's how deep it is, General." That act gained him notoriety among important high-ranking officers, but maybe not so much the everyday people. He also served on the staff of General George McClellan and Alfred Pleasanton with the temporary rank of captain, and eventually that will change. And here's a picture. Can you find Custer there? Well, I'll tell you, the staff of General Fitzjohn Porter, and he's from my home state of New Hampshire, in front of a tent with drinks, pipes, and a dog during the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia. William G. Jones is seated on the chair far right. Nicholas Bowen is laying on the ground, but we don't even care about that because there's Custer laying on the ground on the far right. And you want to know something? He wasn't on Fitzjohn Porter's staff. He just went over to visit and he got into the picture. Why is this guy significant? Well, he's somebody that he knew from West Point, Lieutenant James Barrow Washington. And yes, he is a relative of General George Washington distantly, because he has no direct descendants, though he did adopt his step-grandchildren, Washington, to have direct descendants. So it would be through the line of one of his brothers. So Custer was in Virginia, and as he said, let me tell you this part. As we took our places, Washington called. I kind of did this backwards, but this is the order the pictures are taken. Washington called a little contraband. Unfortunately, that's what the enslaved were many times called, who stood with his mouth open, gazing at the camera, to come to him and said to me, "Custer, suppose we make him one of the group, and wouldn't it be the thing, wouldn't it, to put him near me," laying stress on the words to indicate his pronounced opinions on the rights of the South to claim the Negro. George Armstrong Custer. This was one of the students at West Point when Custer was there. He was behind him, but this young man, it was Custer is saying this guy had been taken as a prisoner of war. I'll tell you about that in a minute, but he is the one that called over the young enslaved man. Lieutenant George Custer, with his former West Point classmate, friend, and captured Confederate soldier, Lieutenant James Barrow, Washington, an aide to General Johnston at Fair Oaks in 1862, which I believe is May 31st, and June 1st was the battle, and he was captured during the battle, and Custer found out he was there, and he knew him, and they had their picture together, and then eventually he'll be a prisoner of war that's eventually released, and goes on to live until he's 60 years old, but he is the one that wanted that young man in the picture. But remember, he is a Confederate, and at that time they were called contrabands. He did not believe, perhaps most likely, in the rights of Blacks to have freedom. He's from the South that was dependent on that system. Not everybody believed that, but he did, from what I could read. Custer calmly led his company during the Battle of First Manassas. You might know it as First Bull Run in July 1861. His reputation for coolness during the Peninsula Campaign near Richmond, Virginia, led him to the appointment of the staff, which I had mentioned before, that he was on George McClellan's staff. McClellan is somebody that eventually will be relieved of duty as the head of the Army of the Potomac by President Lincoln. Writing about Custer, and actually he's going to even run against Lincoln for president in his second term, and he loses. But writing about Custer, which is interesting, McClellan recalled, his head was always clear in danger, and he always brought me clear and intelligible reports. Informative is what he's saying. After the Battle of Antietam, he joined the staff of Alfred Pleasonton, because at that point Lincoln is not happy with McClellan, who didn't do a bunch of anything. It was supposed to be in our Union victory, but it was just a draw. He became, Pleasanton eventually becomes the commander of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, and that's what Custer is in. And there is a picture of Lincoln. And if you look over, and McClellan, he's facing McClellan there, but if you look over on the far right, that man standing up there, but in front of the tent with the sword, there's a controversy about that picture. Some people definitely believe that it is George Custer. Other people believe it's another soldier who has been identified. Don't have a good answer. To me, it has a look of Custer, but I can't say with 100% certainty if that was him or not. But somehow he was there in that picture with Lincoln, if it is him. Okay, and I keep on talking about this area. It's a great area to go visit to learn more about the Civil War and battles that happened in Virginia. But here's George Custer with a dog, and that's the other thing I want to tell you about Custer. Besides being at the bottom of his class, seeking out publicity, he will eventually, according to the experts in the Army of the Potomac and the cavalry, he becomes a good soldier. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but here he is as a lieutenant, George Custer, with a dog. Love dogs. There were many of them. Some will even accompany him when he's at Little Bighorn, but he has his picture taken a lot. And you can find a lot of pictures of Custer at the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division. And one thing I'll mention, eventually Custer's hair, he keeps it pretty long. And if I were to give you a description, some people would say how he perfumed it, how he let it flow behind him. He was at one point by the Native American Indians that are at Little Bighorn called Yellow Hair, among other names. But they did say that he used to perfume his hair and keep it longer. That was during the Civil War. Eventually, when he's in the Indian Wars, he will cut his hair shorter. It was too hard to keep it groomed. But yes, he was concerned with his appearance. June 1863 brought Custer a surprising promotion to Brigadier General of Volunteers. Now remember, there's two armies. There's the United States Army that was already established, which he was a part of, and then there's the Army of the Volunteers, and they will get honorary titles for the duration of the war. Everything will go back when the war is over. But he's a brigadier general. What is he, 23 years old? Of the Michigan Brigade of Cavalry. Custer took command on July 29th, 1863, and led his brigade immediately into a ferocious combat at Gettysburg later that week. After leading a pivotal charge on July 3rd, the legend of the young cavalier and his Wolverines began to grow. Custer's tactics were often fearless and aggressive. And I will tell you one thing at the battle at Gettysburg at East Cavalry Field, which gets overlooked. I've been guilty of it. Yes, he dealt a blow. Let me read you what it says. Despite the Army of Potomac's victory at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army escaped. Custer's soldiers pursued. They didn't catch up with him. That was a criticism of Meade, who was commanding the Army of the Potomac at the time, that he let them escape. But Custer, very aggressive. We get a victory. He goes head to head with Jeb Stuart, who was the head of the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee, and they were supposed to be the best. And he does go after them aggressively. They do, in my opinion, defeat them. But this whole battle, this part of the battle is often overlooked because at the same time, and I do believe it's a coincidence, the Battle of Pickett's Charge is taking place where those men are walking straight off on the field into a hail of lead. But this was quite the battle, and it does give them a victory as far as this is concerned. And these are just some pictures I took at East Cavalry Field, some of the signs that they have. I'll read you just a little bit. That was number 3 there. Let me go back. It says, dismounted Confederate cavalry armed with single-shot carbines cover the woods on Crest Ridge and advance towards the Rummel Farm, seen in the distance, towards this position. As artillery thundered 3 miles to the east, that's Pickett's charge. A prelude to Pickett's charge, dismounted troopers of the East 1st Cavalry, New Jersey, opened fire. Reinforced by Michigan, that's Custer, and Pennsylvania cavalrymen, some armed with repeating rifles, they forced the outgunned Confederates back. Unable to dislodge the Union defenders, Confederate Jeb Stuart ordered a series of cavalry charges, but was ultimately repulsed. So he's turned back. I thought I had put all 3 signs in there, but there are 3 very descriptive signs there that you can read. Let me read you just a bit about Custer, even though you can't see the sign. It says, across the fields, Union General David Gregg's 4,500 horsemen engaged Confederate Jeb Stuart's 6,000 troops that emerged from the distant woods behind him, accelerating in formation from walk to gallop, sabers glinting in the sun. Seeing the Confederates advance, Union General George Custer spurred his horse to the front of the 1st Michigan count, shouting, "Come on, you Wolverines." Captain William Miller of the 3rd Pennsylvania said, a more determined and vigorous charge was never my fortune to witness. Enemies collided, sabers slashed, guns fired, men and horses screamed. Union troops finally pushed the Confederates from the field. And Custer is noted, he did a great job that day, is considered, but not without controversy, because though he leads the 7th Cavalry, and yes, their nickname was the Wolverines. It goes back to something between Ohio and Michigan, way back before the Civil War. But he often used that to rally his men. But he also lost 250 men that day. Keep that in mind. I think he had about 1,900 troops going directly against about 4,000 or 5,000. There were more cavalry there, but I'm just referring to those engaged. And this is the monument, East Cavalry Field, to the Michiganders. And there's a statue on the top, but if you look, you can see a little round face there, and that is the face of Custer, because his 7th Cavalry was considered to do an amazing job and got the enemy from the field. Oh, here's the rest of them. That's the first sign that kind of tells you how they became engaged. And there's so much more I could tell you about this battle, but I'm going to just inspire you to go visit Gettysburg and check it out. And there he is there that I just read to you. I'm going to talk about Custer's wife for a minute, and I'll go back in time and tell you how they met. But Libby Custer was comfortable on the field and in the presence of the powerful in Washington, D.C. Artist James E. Taylor depicted her riding side saddle with the general nearing Winchester, Virginia. I don't know how they ever did that. And presenting battle flags captured by George Custer's men to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and that's from the National Park Service site. And here's Libby Custer. And even though we're in the middle of talking about the Civil War, I just kind of want you to get to know her and her influence over Custer, even during the Civil War. She had Elizabeth Cliff Bacon had a childhood of privilege and sadness. Her mother died before her 13th birthday, and Libby spent the next several years enrolled at a local seminary school, Boyd's, where she graduated in 1862 at the top of her class. 1 year earlier, her husband had graduated at the bottom of his West Point class. So you wouldn't think they had a lot in common. She was definitely a much more of a student. Libby and George met shortly after her graduation. Now, I have to tell you, there's other stories that say they were childhood friends, but I believe this is the correct timeline. But until Custer earned promotion to brigadier general, this is why it's important, because that just happened just before Gettysburg, of volunteers, and distinguished himself in the Gettysburg campaign. Libby's father, that's her nickname, a judge, disapproved of the match between his daughter and Custer. He worried that Libby would not adjust well to Army life and that marriage to an officer would be a step down in her social standing. She had a pretty wealthy childhood, and I think she is the only child that survives, and she's very precious to her father. But her commitment to being by her husband's side remains steadfast. And so finally, they get to exchange vows on February 6, 1864. That summer and fall, while her husband took part in the General Philip Sheridan's campaign in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, which if you haven't visited, you need to go. Libby stayed in Washington and observing and absorbing the culture of the national capital. She hated being away from her husband, by the way. And she met many of the war's most famous figures, including Lincoln. And Lincoln said something like that he was worried about, Custer losing not his oomph, but, he's an aggressive fighter. And that maybe marriage would change that. That's just a little mildly misogynistic, but Libby assures him that that's not going to happen. And she is so supportive of his career. And many times she is with him in some pretty rough places, including sleeping in tents where she gets soaking wet and other things. But she would go with him to places like Texas and Kansas and the Dakotas and so on. There's a picture of her on her wedding day. So now you know that they're married, and she's going to have great influence on their career. And I will tell you that they are they are madly in love, a very devoted couple, and this is going to affect Custer's career later on. In 1864, the Federal Army of the Potomac had undergone some great changes. Custer was now under Philip Sheridan, general, the new commander of the Federal Cavalry, and another aggressive fighter. Custer and the Michigan Brigade played an active role during the taxing, exhausting 1864 Overland Campaign. They fought at the Wilderness, which is basically the same area as Chancellorsville, but there are all kinds of fires. Wilderness is a very rough place to fight. No, you know that. No fighting is good. Yellow Tavern. Why is that significant? Because that is where Jeb Stuart, the head of Confederate cavalry, is killed. Last I knew, there was just a little tiny sign there. There's nothing left of the battlefield, but that is a cavalry fight. And Trevilian Station, which is a brutal fight that Custer takes part in. In August of 1864, most of the Federal cavalry, including Custer, were assigned to the newly overhauled. They're into a new place. They're not with the Army of the Potomac. They're with the Army of the Shenandoah, as in the Valley. And that is commanded by a familiar general, you know his name, Philip Sheridan. Custer had earned his trust and was soon leading his brigade against the Confederate Rangers led by John Singleton Mosby. He was a guerrilla fighter. And that was guerrilla warfare, which blurred the lines between the front lines and the home front. And after the Federal victory at Third Winchester, and that's a town you'll find out, and also where battles take place, and it keeps on changing sides throughout the war. But Custer's performance pleases those in charge, and he is elevated to the command of the Army's 3rd Cavalry Division. His troops participated in the hard war policy that destroyed the Shenandoah Valley's farms and wheat field. And there's so many places that battles take place. There's a route that you can follow. In October, Custer was victorious at the Battle of Tom's Brooks and led an assault that broke the Confederate left flank at Cedar Creek. Been there. And Sheridan nominated Custer for a promotion to brevet Major General of Volunteers soon after. That is amazing for him at such a young age. Returning to the Army of the Potomac in the spring of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse, Custer's division is going to trap the Confederate Army, leading to the surrender of General Robert E. Lee. And actually, he's going to have somebody come to him with a flag of truce. On April 15th, 1865, Custer was promoted to the Major General of Volunteers, making him the youngest general in the Federal Army at age 25. So during this battle, these Civil War, he is recognized. He is a hard fighter. There's some concern about some of his tactics and his desire to be a superstar, to be recognized, but he is thought of very highly. Libby and George posed together not long after his promotion to Major General of the Volunteers. As a pin, she wears a version of the Custer Medal designed by her husband that he gave to his troops. In their home at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, George and Libby will surround themselves with mementos of the Civil War. And that's where one of the places they'll soon be. He hung portraits during the Indian War. Just thought I would mention that since we're talking about them together. Of McClellan, you know who he is, and Sheridan in his library, and she described how much the couple treasured the 2 examples of sculpture John Roberts' groupings, mass-produced plaster statues of various Civil War scenes with which they crisscrossed the Great Plains. So they're talking about, this is during the Indian Wars. They're headed there for that, but they're talking about the Civil War and all the mementos and things that depict, that elevated Custer. Life traveling in the back of army wagons did not particularly suit the statues, but Libby explained to readers that her husband's first chore and she does write some books. I'll talk about that in a minute. Upon unpacking his library, it was mending the figurines depicted in Wounded to the Rear and Letter Day. That's the name of 2 statues. Looking upon the figures with guests, many of whom were Civil War veterans, sparked lively conversations about the war and how participants remembered their service. So we've come to the end of the Civil War. With the end of the Civil War, the U.S. volunteers disbanded. Custer reverted to the rank of captain in the regular army because it's no longer a volunteer army. So that was just an honorary title, though he was promoted to a lieutenant colonel in 1866. And now his life will change. In 1867, serving under General Winfield Hancock, Custer would see his first real experience in the West, a campaign to enter into peace negotiations with Southern Cheyenne and Kiowas along the Arkansas River. Hancock the Superb, that was his nickname, and one of Custer's other nicknames besides yellow hair is Boy General. Custer would find their personal and professional reputations badly tarnished by the military fiasco known as Hancock's War. And by the way, I did skip over to some places that they served, but let me assure you that Libby went with him everywhere. And this is going to be a big change for them. And Hancock was a hero during the Civil War, and he was at Pickett's Charge where he was wounded. And he actually was here in Fort Myers way back in the day. But he had an amazing reputation until the part of the Indian Wars. Hancock's men and Custer set out to confer with these Native American Indians to determine if they wanted to fight, in which case, this is a quote, Hancock, will indulge them. And that's quoting Custer. But as commander of the military department of the Missouri, Hancock inadvertently annoyed Indian leaders at the outset. And I'm going to keep using the word Indian because that's what they used at the time. Today, we would most likely say Native American. He lectured them at great length about their responsibility as chiefs during a stormy parley at Fort Larned. I don't find many chiefs here, he said. I have a great deal to say to the Indians. Tomorrow I'm going to your camp. Now, number one, he doesn't know anything about, and I'm certainly not an expert, but any of these tribes, each one of them were different. Each leader was different, but they didn't run as though they were a military organization or even as though they have a president. Sometimes chiefs did things in different ways. I've done some reading, but he was pretty, let's just say, dismissive and condescending towards them. The chiefs, remembering the massacre of the Cheyenne women and men at Sand Creek, Colorado, 3 years earlier, didn't wait around for Hancock's visit. During the summer of that year, his regiment faced problems with desertion, and Custer, the disciplinarian, and he loved fun, with his friends, but when he's in military role, he is very harsh. During one instance, he gave the orders to shoot down deserters. He wasn't supposed to be doing that as a lieutenant colonel. There were other people in charge above him, and initially refused to give the survivors of this medical treatment. For Custer, the second major event that summer, listen to what he did, was when he left his assigned post without orders to be with his wife, Libby. He missed her terribly. She missed him. There was a lot going on. He had shot the deserters. He didn't give them medical treatment. He overstepped. And so he just went riding off, go back to see his wife, who was at Fort Abraham Lincoln. You know what happened to the boy general? To the favored one, he was promptly arrested. Now, remember, he almost was court-martialed before. This time he will be, and charged with absence without leave, conduct to the prejudice of good orders and military discipline, and the unmerciful treatment of deserters. During his court-martial in October of 1867, he was found guilty of all charges and sentenced with suspension of rank and pay for 1 year. And this is that one of those first battles with Hancock, where they're burning the village of the Indians. At the end, he said, so what happens to Hancock? He's stripped of his rank and his pay for more than 1 year. To Custer, that is what happens. And you know what he does? He goes back to Monroe, where he would stay for more than a year, because he has to go back. Then he is tried, and then he's at home and he's bombarded. He bombarded the newspapers and politicians with letters, and eventually he's in Michigan. And you know who he's blaming? Is he pointing a finger at himself? Absolutely not. He is blaming completely Hancock. I think there was plenty of fault to go around, but he abandoned his post. He shot deserters. He has riled up the Indians. He has got them very upset by his behavior, he and Hancock. And he doesn't think he deserves this punishment, by the way. And of course, Libby is going to agree with him, takes her side. 10 months into Custer's punishment, let me go back here. General Philip Sheridan in 1868 decides that he needs Custer back. because in campaigns against the Cheyenne Indians who'd been making raids in Kansas and Oklahoma that summer, Sheridan was frustrated by the officers. So like he and Hancock are having a split. He's trying to bring him down. He's going to salvage his reputation, Custer is. But he already has a currency. Sheridan already likes him, and he thinks that his officers aren't doing what they need to engage the enemy. And despite of his poor record and unpopularity with the men of the 7th Cavalry, Sheridan believes Custer is a good fighter. Now, remember, he had a great reputation with some questions about leaving people behind and things, but now he's shot people. So Sheridan wants him. So on November, and he believes Custer is a good fighter. So on November 26th, Custer located a large village of Cheyenne and camped near the Washita River, just outside of the present-day Cheyenne, Oklahoma. Custer did not identify which group of Cheyenne was in the village or make a reconnaissance of the situation. If he had done so, and this is where his whole reputation goes to heck, you know, even though there were a few questions, it was pretty stellar during the Civil War. He would have discovered that they were a peaceful village and that the village was on reservation soil where they're supposed to be safe, where the commander of Fort Cobb had guaranteed them safety. There was even a white flag flying from one of the main dwellings. Custer ignores all this. Having surrounded the village the night before at dawn, Custer called for the regimental band to play Gary Owen, which signaled for the 4 columns of soldiers to charge in the sleeping village. So are people that have already agreed, this is their land, but they've already agreed to be on a reservation. They are peaceful. They have an order of protection from the commander of Fort Cobb, and there goes Custer. And let me tell you about the song Gary Owen, which is this Irish song, but the 7th Cavalry during the Civil War had adopted it. It was a fighting and a drinking song. And they use it to signal the start of this battle. And eventually there will be an area known as Gary Owen, by the way, a town that will get named that, which is originally a company town. But outnumbered and caught unaware, scores of Cheyenne were killed in the first 15 minutes of the battle. Though a small number of the warriors managed to escape to the trees and return fire. Within a few hours, the village was destroyed. The soldiers had killed 103 Cheyenne, including the peaceful chief, Black Kettle, and many women and children. They just went recklessly and did that. But guess what? This is such a disgrace. It was acclaimed as the first substantial American victory in the Indian Wars. The battle helped restore Custer's reputation, at least in the public, I don't know about in the army, and succeeded in persuading many Cheyenne to move to the reservation. But I'm assuming that many in the army supported that, but I'm sure there were some people that still had questions based on what I've read. And by the way, there's so many things that go on. I can't put them all in here. And sometimes there's conflicting reports. So I pick what I consider the most accurate and best information. But please do more research. There's so much to talk about when it comes to the Indian Wars. And I'm going to be honest, I just knew a little inkling. I know a little bit more, but there's so much more to learn. By 1875, the government had decided quietly but decisively to seize the Black Hills in the Dakotas, despite the protections guaranteed to the Lakota. When I say Lakota, that is part of the Sioux Indians in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. You know what changes everything? The discovery of gold in the Black Hills that started the Black Hills Gold Rush. They couldn't keep people out, which followed George Armstrong Custer's 1874 expedition there. The region had been recognized by treaty as a sacred hunting ground of Lakota. And there's disagreement as to how much gold there is there. There's some people believe there was a lot, but there's some evidence that it was just a small amount, but it didn't keep people out at this point once that information got out. By April of 1875, Custer and Brigadier General Alfred Terry began preparing for war with Lakota Sioux. And some of this land is not even there, so they're guaranteed the sacred hunting ground. There's other places where it was the land of the Crow. And the Crow Indians, some of them did work with Custer as scouts. It's very complex. There's many Indians, different ones, people that agreed to be on reservations, people that didn't want it, many different tribes of Indians. It's not even easy to sort out, but there were so many people. But what I will tell you at this point, our policy had changed. Originally, Grant wants things to be peaceful, but then they decide that they need a battle and they need that land, and they're going to put Indians on reservations. That's a sweeping generalization, but you get the idea. In full inspections and arms inventories are ordered. They're going to be ready for war. In July and August, the political point of no return was passed when every Native leader rejected the terms. Every Native leader that's in this area. We could examine U.S. history as far as all Indians and what we've done to them. That's not the focus of this, but there's much more that you can read about what has happened to them. In November to December 1875, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum. All Lakota Sioux living outside reservations must report to agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be treated as hostile. Okay, number one, we've got very little time. And this order was logistically impossible. It's winter, it's hard to move, and was understood by both sides as the guise for war. There was no way they could do it. There was no way the terms were even acceptable. They couldn't even physically get there. So the Great Sioux War is going to break into open fighting on March 17th, 1876, with the Battle of Powder River. So there's this war with all these battles. And there was no effort really to make an effort at having peace, because it was impossible to achieve the way this was going. And this is Custer's quarters at Fort Abraham Lincoln. I've talked about that before, in North Dakota, in November 1873. And this is the 7th Cavalry officers. This is who Custer is leading with their families, including Custer's wife, Libby, his brother, Tom, and their brother-in-law, Captain James C. Calhoun, and his wife, Margaret Custer Calhoun, so Custer's sister. And this is from the Library of Congress, and I cut some of this off, but I bet you guys can find Custer here. Can you see him? I'm going to let you figure out where he is. All right, I'll tell you. It's kind of cut off. I cut off the guy to his left. So if you count the person whose shoulder you could just see on the far left, the next person is Custer. There he is. And then up on the right, the last full person that you can see, or the second one down, if you can see that is his brother, Tom. And Libby and his sister are here, and his brother-in-law. By 1875, it was known that high-ranking officials in Washington, this is important, were involved in a scandal that involved the selling of trading rights at forts, making them exclusive, and posts along the upper Missouri region. You're going to hear about all kinds of political corruption here. The licenses needing to trade at the military forts were issued by the Secretary of War, William Belknap, and in March and April of 1876. Custer's going to make himself some enemies, because he testified before a congressional hearing that the Secretary Belknap was involved in graft, corruption. Custer's testimony, in addition, it put Custer's testimony attached the President of the United States, Grant's own brother, Orville, to the corruption. This put Custer in a precarious situation with the Commander-in-Chief, the President, Grant, who is a great general, but becomes a great general, but not such a great president. With a lot going on that he didn't realize was even happening, but a very corrupt administration. And they need Custer at the time, they think, and he was presently the president is overseeing the final planning stages of an offensive non-treaty Lakota for the Lakotas and Cheyennes, and Custer testifies against the President of the United States, brother, the Secretary of War, and now they've got this aggressive policy that he wants to be out there going after the non-treaty Lakotas and Cheyennes. Basically, people have not agreed to have a treaty and be on a reservation. So why is this important? Well, never mind just the corruption in the U.S. government and influencing the treaty over Indians, but it just like Custer almost wasn't there and history could have been changed. But guess what? Eventually, he's allowed to command the 7th Cavalry for the upcoming campaign for the summer of 1876. Now, history could have been changed. And by the way, that was from National Park Service. But maybe the Battle of Little Bighorn wouldn't have taken place. A lot of battles wouldn't have taken place. Or maybe they would have. We'll never know. But he wouldn't have been there. But then he was. They agreed to let him be there. Sheridan needs him. So Brigadier General George Crook, along with 1,050 soldiers, 260 Crow and Shoshone scouts, came from the Wyoming to seek out and force the Sioux, Lakota Sioux, to accept the reservation confinement. On the morning of June 17, 1876, General Crook and his men were taking a rest near the headwaters of Rosebud Creek when they were surprised by an attack of warriors led by Sioux chief Crazy Horse and Cheyenne's chiefs Young Two Moon, and Spotted Wolf. The early warning and delaying action by Crook's Indian allies saved his command from a devastating, surprising attack. The long and the bloody battle lasted for 6 hours as charges and countercharges were made across a 3-mile wide front. That's a long time. Battle Little Bighorn, the part that Custer's in, 1 hour. Estimates of casualties, and how does this affect Custer? Well, I'm going to tell you that. By both the soldiers and the Indians vary widely, with Crook and his officers reporting different numbers from 10 to 28 killed, 21 to 56 wounded. We just don't know the final total. It was probably more. The warriors suffered similar casualties. The Indians. Crook claimed victory because he and his men still occupied the battlefield at the end of the day. And that's how they used to claim victory, though sometimes it didn't mean that they actually won. However, though you can understand why most of the time it was considered that. For his wounded and short on supplies, the men retraced their steps and returned to their camp on Goose Creek near Sheridan, Wyoming. They would remain there for the next 7 weeks, awaiting reinforcements. The Shoshone and Crow allies left the army shortly after the battle. General Gibbon, General Alfred Terry, and Custer met on June 26, with General Alfred Terry giving Custer free rein to discover the location of the Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne. And the three that are going to be in charge, they plan to meet again on June 26 or June 27th. They would not do so. I think you know the answer to why that happened, what's going on, but those are the men that are planning the battle. Many of the Indian bands in their remote and scattered winter camps likely did not receive these orders and could not have reached the government agencies. I talked about this before, but it's winter, it's remote. They probably didn't find them all and could not have reached the government agencies as whole communities, including women and children, if they had. In the face of the threats from the Army, from us, these non-reservation bands came together under the leadership of Sitting Bull. He was considered a very charismatic leader. He is a Sioux leader who advocated resistance to the U.S. expansion and inspired his people with some impressive religious visions. And he had many, including something to do with the Battle of Little Bighorn, that the Indians would achieve a victory. When the hunting season arrived in the spring, many more Native Americans left the reservations that they were already on and to join Sitting Bull. They didn't want to be confined. this had been their hunting grounds. These are places they were free to go, and now they are being forced onto reservations. So some of them are leaving and joining Sitting Bull, and he had a growing number of followers eventually that made camp on the Little Bighorn River, a branch of the Bighorn River in southern Montana territory. And that's a picture of Sitting Bull by D.F. Berry in 1883. And I don't go into the story of Sitting Bull here, but eventually after the war, he'll end up at Canada. He travels with Buffalo Bill for a while, and unfortunately, he will be killed, as will the other chief that was their Crazy Horse. This is General Alfred Crook. And let me tell you what happens. General Sheridan, commander of the military, devised a strategy that committed several thousand men to engage the hostile, and that's in quotes, because all they wanted was their ability to hunt, the ability to be on the land. But he's calling the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne hostile, and they wanted them to go to the Great Sioux Reservation. That is not happening for many of them. The campaign set in motion by March of 1876, when a 450-man force of combined cavalry and infantry, commanded by Colonel John Gibbon, I called him a general earlier, marched out of Fort Ellis near Bozeman, Montana. General George Crook sent out from Fort Fetterman, and there he is over there. He was also in the Civil War, as you can see, in central Wyoming territory with around 1,000 cavalry and infantry in late May. A few weeks before that, General Alfred Terry, who Custer is attached to, left from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Bismarck, Dakota territory with 879 men. The bulk of this force was the 7th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer. And as an aside, I don't ever talk about this, but Custer's nickname many times was Autie, A-U-T-I-E, because his middle name Armstrong, and when he was young, he couldn't pronounce it. So many of his family called him by that name. It was expected that any one of these three forces would be able to deal with the 800 to 1,500. They put warriors here. I obviously, that was a term that somebody else had used that I put in there, but Indians, but they are ready to go to war. They were likely to encounter. The three commands of Gibbon, Crook, and Terry were not expected to launch a coordinated attack. No coordination on a specific Indian village at a known location. Why not? Let me tell you, inadequate, slow, and often unpredictable communications hampered the Army's coordination of its expeditionary forces. They are exploring what's going on. They didn't coordinate it. They didn't communicate. Furthermore, they're hampered by the nomadic lifestyle of the Lakota and Cheyenne people. They're always on the move. They're not staying in one place now. It's not winter. No officer or scout could be certain how long a village might remain stationary before they moved. So why they thought they could have an uncoordinated battle, I have no clue, or which direction the tribe might go to search for water and grazing areas for their cattle, for their horses. So, does it sound like, even talking about it seems so outrageous? The region containing the Powder, Rosebud, Bighorn, and Bighorn, and Yellowstone rivers was a productive hunting grounds, and the tribes gathered in large numbers during early summer to celebrate their annual Sundance ceremony. This ceremony had occurred about 2 weeks earlier near present-day Lame Deer, Montana. During the ceremony, Sitting Bull received a vision of soldiers falling upside down into his village. He prophesied that there soon would be a great victory for his people. And there will be. On the morning of June 25th, the camp was full of rumors about soldiers on the other side of the Wolf Mountains, 15 miles to the east. Yet few people paid any attention. In the words of Low Dog, an Oglala Lakota Sioux, and there are many types of Lakota Sioux, many branches. I did not think anyone would come and attack us so strong as we were. So basically, they were formidable. Why would anybody go after them? Well, they underestimated the terrain, they underestimated the Indians. On June 22nd, General Terry decided to detach Custer and his 7th Cavalry to make a wide flanking march and approach the Indians from the east and south. Custer was to act as the hammer and prevent the Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies from slipping away and scattering. A common fear expressed by government and military authorities. Okay. General Terry and Colonel Gibbon with infantry and cavalry would approach from the north, and they're going to be the anvil to Custer's hammer in support of Custer's far-reaching movements towards the headwaters of the Tongue and Little Bighorn rivers. The Indians, who were thought to be camped somewhere along the Little Bighorn River, would be so completely enclosed as to make their escape virtually impossible. They left out a lot of information about the terrain they underestimated. This is a reenactment. As the largest contingent under General Terry, Custer's forces arrived at an overlook 14 miles east of the Little Bighorn River on the night of June 24th, 1876. The rest were marching towards the mouth of Little Bighorn to provide a blocking action. In the meantime, 2 Crow Indian scouts were sent ahead to survey the situation, returning with a warning that a vast Indian encampment was situated at the Little Bighorn River. Custer ignored this news, dividing his regiment into 4 commands with plans to continue the attack. There was a packed train with ammunition and supplies. That was 125 men, 3 companies commanded by Captain Frank Benteen, 3 companies, 140 men commanded by Major Marcus Reno, and 5 companies, 210 men, commanded by Custer. Benteen was ordered to march southwest to locate any Indians, pitch into anything he found, and send word to Custer. Expecting the Indians to flee at the first sign of assault, Custer moved his men forward on June 25th. After that warning, I don't know why he went forward, but he did. They didn't have sufficient knowledge of the village's size, but Custer moved his men, and then Major Reno, the 1st Battalion, was ordered to attack. So soon Reno's squadron of 175 soldiers prepared an assault at the southern end of the Indian village. That was unbelievable. However, they quickly realized the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne force was so much larger than they had anticipated, and they had no signs of fleeing at seeing the soldiers because they had the advantage. Why would they? He soon sent a message to Custer, but Reno launched his offensive northward when he received no response. He is way outnumbered. Eventually, Reno is going to order a second retreat, this time to the bluffs east of the river. The Lakota and Cheyenne rode them down. Soldiers at the rear of Reno's fleeing command incurred heavy casualties as warriors galloped alongside the fleeing troops and shot at them at close range. He should have never attempted that, even though he didn't hear back from Custer, or pulled them out of their saddles onto the ground. Reno's command was now shattered and recrossed the Little Bighorn River and struggled. I think he lost 40-something men, steep bluffs, to regroup on the high ground, the east of the valley fight, maybe even more, a few more. Meanwhile, Captain Benteen returned after finding no evidence of the Indians or their movements to the south. He arrived on the bluffs in time to find Reno's demoralized survivors, and he's found nothing. A previous messenger from Custer had delivered a written note to Benteen that stated, "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." Said it twice. An effort was made to locate Custer after heavy gunfire was heard downstream. He made no attempt to find anyone. Led by Captain Weir's D Company, troops moved north in an attempt to establish communication with Custer. There, the troops could see clouds of dust and gun smoke covering the battlefield. Large numbers of Indians approaching from that direction forced the cavalry to withdraw to Reno Hill, named after him, obviously, after the fact, where the Indians held them under siege from the afternoon of June 25th until dusk on June 26th. On the evening of June 26th, the entire village began to move south towards Custer. This is what's happening, though. The troops that are Reno's troops, Benteen's troops, do not continue towards Custer's men now for at least an hour, and their failure to move would prompt criticism that Benteen had failed to follow the orders to march to the sounds of the guns. And that was absolutely true. He did not. Remember the first time he didn't even find anyone. And I just threw this picture here of Custer with his Crow Scouts and some dogs. One of the dogs will actually go into battle with him. The others were left behind with the caretaker. Custer underestimated the terrain he would travel before launching his assault. There are so many mistakes here. He didn't think about negotiating the bluffs and the ravines before reaching a position where the soldiers could attack. They weren't that familiar with the land and how long it would take them to get across. And that effort by Benteen, what happened to Reno's troops, it's all going to affect what happened to Custer. And a force of Sioux under Crazy Horse quickly moved downstream and doubled back in a sweeping arc, covering Custer and his soldiers. As the Sioux closed in on Custer, 3.5 miles north of Reno and Benteen, Custer ordered his men to shoot their horses and stack the carcasses to form a wall. However, the horses provided sight protection against the onslaught of bullets and arrows raining upon Custer and his 210 men. Custer and his men were killed in the worst American military disaster of the time in less than an hour. And dismounting at the south end of the ridge, companies C and L appear, and this is all supposition from many different authors and many different opinions. There might be things that happened differently because nobody was there. Just their bones were found later on. But they appeared to put up a fierce resistance before being overwhelmed. Company I perished on the east side of the ridge. The survivors rushed towards the hill at the northwest end of the Long Ridge. It is thought that Company E attempted to drive warriors from the deep ravines on the west side of the ridge before being consumed in fire and smoke in one of the ravines they were trying to clear. Company F likely tried to fire at warriors on the flats below the National Cemetery before being driven to the last stand site. And you know where that is. That is where Custer was. About 40 of the 210 men were trapped on the hill where the stone monument now stands that talks about that battle. And it's to the men, but there are monuments erected for the Native Americans, the Indians that died there as well, marking the spot. There was signage there as well at the time that has since been removed temporarily because of President Trump's orders about what signage is permitted and what is not, as far as history that he does not believe that is favorable to the United States. I just will state that this is what happened. And we went to the Native American lands and tried to seize them. And we did a terrible job of it. Hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors surrounded them. These 40 men that were trapped on the hill. Toward the end of the fight, soldiers, some on foot, others on horseback, ran in a desperate attempt to get away. All were pulled, and killed in a matter of minutes. The warriors quickly rushed to the top of the hill, killing the last wounded. There's a picture from the Missouri Historical Society, Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn. His hair, that's not really an accurate depiction. He's got a sword, or he's dressed not in his uniform, and his hair is long. He had cut his hair because of hygienic reasons. It was easier to maintain. This is a tragedy all the way around, and it was our policy towards the Native Americans that started this. But Custer's men were slaughtered, and some of Reno's men were slaughtered as well. So rough. It was a debacle. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led United Tribes to victory against General George Armstrong Custer. Sitting Bull was shot and killed by an Indian agency on Standing Rock Indian Reservation in 1890. In September 1877, 4 months after surrendering to U.S. troops under George Crook, Crazy Horse was fatally wounded by a bayonet from a military guard while allegedly resisting imprisonment at Camp Robinson in northwestern Nebraska, though he had actually at first had gone there with his people because they were starving. Their hunting lands had basically been destroyed. Let me tell you just very briefly, because I know I've talked for a long time about what's going on here. This is the younger brother of George Armstrong Custer, Captain Thomas Custer of the 7th U.S. Cavalry. He participated with his brothers in the Little Bighorn campaign as a civilian packer. On June 25th, 1876, he left the pack train to join his brother's battalion and died with his brothers. He's a civilian. And his nephew, Harry Oddie Reed, you can tell that that's Custer's nickname. He was named that part's after him. And his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, was married to Custer's sister. Harry Armstrong Reed was connected. He's a nephew of George Armstrong, Thomas Custer, and Boston Custer. Even though he wasn't in the military, he died with them at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was 18 years old. He is the son of Custer's sister. He became a beef herder for the 7th Cavalry. He was very excited to join them in the Great Sioux Wars. And then he was never officially a soldier. He volunteered to help. Normally, it wouldn't have been allowed, but because he was part of the Custer clan, that was a group of Custer friends and family, he went with his 3 uncles because they gave him permission. There were other people, an orderly for the regiment wanted to go, but he wasn't allowed to, and he teased him, saying, "You're mad because you can't go along." Then he rode off on his horse to join the fight, and he died. And James Calhoun is a brother-in-law of Custer. He's a 2nd lieutenant in the infantry. While visiting her brother in Libby, Margaret Custer meets him. They marry. Then she would go to Fort Abraham Lincoln as well. George helps him get a promotion. He becomes a lieutenant in the cavalry. He's part of the Custer clan, and he fought in the Black Hills War. And he was leading Company L during the Battle of Little Bighorn. Broke Margaret's heart, of course, along with Libby's heart. Lost so many of the Custer family, and his remains eventually, as all the remains will be removed from the battlefield, but they're moved to Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. Many of the men are buried there. This is George Armstrong Custer with his wife Libby and brother Tom. Tom won 2 medals of honor in 3 days in April of 1865. All those men were killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn. I'm going to move myself over here. In 1865, Stanton presents Custer with the Congressional Medal of Honor, 2 of them for his gallantry at the Mosine Church, and he presented him with the Second Medal of Honor for his actions at Sailor's Creek. These are battles near the end of the Civil War. And it was because of his extraordinary actions. He captures the enemy's flag. He captured two strands of color. He gets two flags in the next battle, and he had his short horse shot from under him, receiving a severe wound. He was very heroic. He was considered to be very heroic in the Civil War, but he dies with his brother. This is Libby Custer at the in her mourning clothes after she hears that Custer has died. They are waiting for the news. The family is devastated. Margaret is there. They've lost so many people. She and Custer were so close. I could do a presentation on Libby because she's going to spend the rest of her life, some people believe, building up her husband's reputation. She writes 3 different books. I've read one of them, Boots and Saddles, where she talks about life with the 7th Cavalry, life with, and tells what happens. But I mean, she loves her husband. She ultimately is trying to defend his reputation, and she's in mourning clothes for the rest of her life. Beside Custer State Park in South Dakota, there are numerous counties and cities throughout the U.S. named Custer in his honor. He's been the subject of books and songs, including the ones written by his wife. He's subject of paintings distributed at one point by the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company and portrayed in many movies. Those men's, a lot was done to their bodies after they were killed. They eventually buried in shallow graves on the battlefields that are marked by stones today. But for a long time, their bones, to be quite blunt, laid on the battlefields. But eventually he is moved and interred with full military honors on October 10th, 1877 at West Point. Eventually, Libby will be also buried there. In 1879, General William Tecumseh Sherman issues a general order designating a part of the battlefield as a national cemetery and is transferred from the Army to the National Park Service. And that's some of the stones where the bodies were found. But they were put in later. I didn't put the pictures in of their bones, but that there is not supposed to be bodies there today. But some are at Fort Leavenworth, it's different places, but Custer is there. They had to wait till 1878 for the remains of Boston Custer and his nephew finally coming home. The bodies had never been preserved. Those are my sources. I would like to go there. It's a piece of history. I will tell you right now, they are trying to build a new visitor center, but right now it is only open Friday, Saturday, and Sundays. However, you may go visit the Gettysburg and you can see this land. I missed East Calvary Field for years and walked the land. That is how that you discovered what happened there. You need to walk the land. I know some about what happened here, but when you stand there and you hear the story, and you don't always hear the same story, but you learn so much. And if you go to Gettysburg, you can hire a battlefield guide, which you should do. They can tell you more about what happened there. I thank you so much for your support and joining me. Thank you.